we're going to keep pushing ahead to the next section of the Haggadah. And I think I mentioned over the last few weeks, I think it's going to take us many years to get through the Magid section with, four sessions before Passover each year. But last week we spoke about the four questions, and we talked about the evolution of those questions, and we looked at the questions in different forms over the course of history. And so now this week, we are going to look together at the next section of the Haggadah, which is what the rabbis suggest to us is perhaps our answer to the four questions. So I'd love to start by just kind of helping to orient us in our Haggadah. So I'm on Sefaria right now, and I'm opening up our liturgy tab and our Passover Haggadah. And we see when we're looking through this long Magid section, we talked about Halach Ma'anya. We talked about the four questions. And then this week, we're looking at this section called We Were Slaves in Egypt. I'm going to get the Hebrew up here too. So after we recite the four questions, then we actually uncover our matzah and we read this next paragraph, which we'll look at together. Avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim, v'yotzienu Adonai Eloheinu misham beyad chazaka uvizroa netuya. We were slaves in Egypt, and God brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. Ve'ilu lo hotzi hakadosh baruch hu et avotenu mimitzrayim, hare anu uvanenu uvnei vanenu mishubadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim. And if the Holy One, blessed be God, had not brought our ancestors out of Egypt, then we and our children and our children's children would still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And then this next section in some Haggadot is attached to the sentences that have come before it. And in some Haggadot they're actually separated as a more distinct prelude to the next section. In this Haggadah, it's included together. So we're going to look at it all together today. Va'afilu kulanu chachamim, kulanu nivonim, kulanu zekenim, kulanu yodim et haTorah, mitzvah aleinu lesaper b'tziat mimitzrayim. And so even if we were all wise and all intelligent is how it's being defined here, but chacham and navon are sort of words with similar meanings. Chacham means wise. Navon comes from the Hebrew root lehavin, which means to understand. So even if we were wise and even if we were people full of understanding, even if we were all people of age, and even if we all were people who were knowledgeable in the Torah, it is still a commandment for us to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. V'chol hamarbeh lesaper b'tziat mimitzrayim harei zeh mishubach. And all of those who are, the best way to put it is to kind of do extra, or all who expand upon the telling of the story of the Exodus from Egypt, that is praiseworthy. This is translated here. The more that we talk about the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the more it's praiseworthy. But the more sort of we expand upon that story, the more praiseworthy it is. And then after this, you'll see next year, I guess, that we will get into the story of the rabbis who spent all night on their Passover Seder and had to end their Seder because it was time to recite the morning Shema. So this is sort of the preface to that. So as we have been doing, looking at each section of the Haggadah as we go, I'd love to start again just by asking sort of what jumps out to you and what questions are coming up for you as you look at this text. Steve.
I think that is the command that regardless of how knowledgeable or experienced we may think we are, to continue not only retell, but re-experience the trauma of slavery really is an incredible example of the wisdom of Torah, that throughout our generations, histories of people, we've faced trauma over and over again. And more recently, if we, as a people, experienced the Holocaust, And now we have October 7th and all the sense of chaos now. By bringing us together with joy, we could reaffirm that our life, we're resilient, that we can, and we are commanded to move forward, have the strength to that we can move forward and with determination to continue to build loving and just communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And were the October 7th connection that you made is going to come up, yeah, a little bit later in our conversation today too. So, um, other thoughts, other things that jump out to anybody as you look at this text, or questions that you have? Deb.
Oh, I'm not muted. So one thing, and I don't know if this is the right place to ask the question or where it comes in, but I do not understand the need to completely redo the dishes and the and everything. And why is that important? And how does it fit in with this story?
When you say to redo the dishes, do you mean like to change our dishes or to make them
Yeah.
for Passover? So yeah. So on Passover, and these are all sort of strict interpretations of Jewish concepts and traditions and values, right? But we know that over Passover, we are not supposed to eat leavened foods, right? We don't eat chametz, we eat matzah, and that extends to the idea for many that we should not have any of those foods that are forbidden during Passover in our home at all. And one sort of way around it is that we shouldn't even own them. So perhaps we might keep them in our house somewhere, but we're going to sell them, and so they're not going to belong to us. And so, what this is, and what we see, I would say, in many cases around Jewish law, is that we see a value or a concept, and then the rabbinic interpretations of those values take many people toward a very strict interpretation. And it just so happens in the Jewish world that for whatever reason, and it's hard to know exactly why, there are many people who take a much stricter interpretation of the laws of Passover than they do of the laws of kashrut over the course of the rest of the year. So you'll see that there are people who, for example, may not keep a kosher home during the year, but they're the people with the dustbusters under the couch cushions, while they're cleaning for Passover. And it's really just a sort of like folky Jewish tradition, which is that, many people, Passover is, I believe, actually the most widely marked Jewish holiday of the year, even more so than Hanukkah. Um, and so, that's sort of the time that people decide, like, this time of year we're gonna to take those halachot, those Jewish laws, very seriously, even to the point of changing out our dishes. But the idea is that dishes are considered to be different materials of dishes are considered to be porous in some way. And so that means that potentially, like even with a dishwasher, um, the 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 chametz or the qualities of whatever food was recently eaten on those dishes won't come out fully. You will see that there are some people who will use glass dishes for both meat and dairy because there is one tradition that if you're using glass dishes that in a dishwasher setting that the components really would come out. But anyway, that's a little bit of the background around the dishes. Steve, I think I saw a hand up. Steve Maskin, I think I saw a hand up before, and then I saw it come down. So I don't know if you want to add something.
I was thinking about just how the Haggadah really focuses us on the celebration as one of of connecting with history.
Mm,
I mean, you've probably talked about it before, but in Torah, there are so many different concepts of what this festival is, and only one of them is that.
yes.
And I just find it interesting that the others are really pushed aside. And I assume, because this is what coalesced uh, Jews in diaspora.
Yeah, and I'll say sort of yes and
Hmm.
the and is, and we're going to talk a little bit about this today, that there was pretty robust rabbinic debate around what should be included in the Haggadah and in what order. And in fact, this particular section of the Haggadah was the subject of actually a very famous rabbinic debate, and which led to sort of the inclusion of two possible starts to the Passover story. And so we see, yes, over the years, something has to coalesce into the document that we look at together, but we can actually see in the Haggadah influences of other rabbinic opinions about where the area of focus should be in the retelling of the story over Passover. And that actually applies very specifically to this text that we're looking at today. Um, Steve Kessler.
Well, following what Stephen just said, could we also take a learning that the discussion of different dishes and different foods is a form of an approach in the Torah about how we're supposed to separate from the secular and the mundane to celebrate this festival, a Passover, to hold it up, remove yourself from the everyday existence to really focus on what that's re-experiencing the stories and the messages.
Yes, absolutely. And by way of connecting to our conversation last week, to make this time feel very different for us, which is, sort of like one of the primary commitments that we make over Passover is to make these days feel different in some way to help encourage us to relive and re-experience and reinterpret the the ancient experiences of our ancestors too. So I'd love now to dive into some of our sources. We're actually going to spend the bulk of our time today, not all of it, but we'll see how much time we have, discussing a famous rabbinic debate about this passage. And it's interesting because it's a very, very short passage, but it's a debate that has gotten a lot of attention from our sages over the years. So the first thing I want to start with is just, kind of as we do every week, is to sort of orient us around the biblical references that have influenced the language and the construction of this passage. So we always spend just a minute looking at sort of biblical passages of similar language that help us to understand perhaps why the passage that we looked at looks the way that we do. And here we're looking at two passages from the book of Deuteronomy. The first is from Deuteronomy chapter 6. Sorry, hold on. And we read, Ki yishalcha vincha machar lemor, ma ha'idot v'hachukim v'hamishpatim, asher tziva Adonai Eloheinu etchem. When in time to come your children ask you, what do these decrees and laws and rules that Adonai our God has enjoined upon you, what do they mean? Ve'amarta levincha, Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim, v'yotzienu Adonai mimitzrayim beyad chazaka. Right. So this is are very similar phrasing to the text that we just read. You shall say to your children, we were slaves in Egypt, and Adonai freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand. So it's not exactly the same, but we see here, Avadim hayinu lefaro b'Mitzrayim, v'yotzienu Adonai Eloheinu misham beyad chazaka, uvizroa netuya. So a few words are a little bit different, but we see very, very clear influence from this biblical text. And then there's another one that comes later in the book of Deuteronomy, where we read, "Vayotzienu Adonai mimitzrayim beyad chazaka uvizroa netuya uviv mora gadol uveotot uvimoftim." So God freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm, by awesome power, and by signs and wonders. And so here again, we see Yad Chazakah, right? The mighty hand. And here for the first time, we also see Uvizroa Netuya with awesome power. And that's included in our Avadim Hayinu text as well. As like an interesting aside, this text is often used as the sort of proof text around the importance of the number 4 in the Jewish tradition, that we have 4 cups of wine, we have 4 questions, we have our 4 children, most importantly, our 4 cups of wine. But we see here that God took us out of the land of Egypt with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm, with awesome power, uveotot, uvemoftim, and by signs and portents, and signs and wonders, and you kind of have to combine those to the fourth one. But there are a number of different kind of proof texts that are used to explain why the number 4 is so important in the Passover Seder, and this is one of them. So these are some of sort of just like our biblical roots and foundations of this text that we're looking at. So this text, Avadim Hayinu, is meant to be an answer to the 4 questions, right? Why is this night different from all other nights? And we're supposed to sort of find ways to, teach about what makes this night unique and what captures its essence. And so we looked at this text last week, but I'd like now to focus on a different part of it, around the instructions for how it is that we're supposed to tell the Passover story. So we read in the Mishnah, and again, we looked at this last week, Mazgulo kos sheni, so we mix the second cup of wine, V'chan haben shoel aviv. And here, it's at this point that the son asks his father, Ve'im ein dat baben aviv melamdo. And if the son doesn't have the knowledge to ask the questions, then his father teaches him. And then our text goes into our 4 questions that we read last week. I skipped over those because we read them last week, and what I really want to look at is what comes next. Ulefi da'ato shel ben, this is right after the 4 questions, and according to the knowledge of the son, aviv melamdo, the father teaches him. And then here's the commandment for how we're supposed to do that teaching. Matchil bigenut umisayem b'shevach. So we're supposed to start bigenut with disgrace, umisayem b'shevach, and to conclude with praise. And that's the essence of what the Mishnah is telling us, what our tradition is telling us, needs to be the way in which we teach our children about the story of Passover. We need to start with disgrace, and we need to conclude with praise. Anyone have any thoughts about why the Mishnah? No right or wrong answers to this. I'm not gonna share anything that gives us the answer to this question, but why you think that our rabbis are telling us that the essence of how we must tell the Passover story is to begin with disgrace and conclude with praise. Alan?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I have a question of what it means to conclude with praise. Who or what is being praised?
Okay, great question. So it's interesting because the Mishnah actually originally translated praise as glory. I changed it back to praise, which is sort of a more literal translation of this word, because I believe that this is meant to be talking specifically about praise of God, not the glory of the Jewish people. Steve Maskett.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about your translation of disgrace. I always recalled it as degradation.
That's
which is not very different, but maybe a little, maybe a little different.
So there's a really, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry. No, you finish.
Oh, because I always perceived it as just wallowing in the existence of slavery, our own being slaves, the bricklayers being beaten, all this degradation. So I didn't know how disgrace differs in your.
So there's a really neat, there's a really neat tool that now I have to remind myself though where we are in the Mishnah. Okay, Pesachim 10:4, and we can look at this up together. So Pesachim chapter 10, Mishnah number 4, and then here's our word genut right here, and then if you double click on it on Sefaria, you get the biblical dictionary up here, which is pretty great. So this first definition is not applicable to us because this similar root also means a garden, and that's not what it means here.
Yeah, Gan Eden.
Yeah, right. So here it's translated as here it's translated as disgrace. This is from the Jastrow Dictionary, which is a dictionary of rabbinic terms. You said degradation was what you had always understood as well. And you see
Yeah.
here blame, disgrace. You also see kind of defamation. And so it certainly has similar connotations to what you're saying, that the rabbinic dictionary specifically uses disgrace and blame here, but I certainly think that degradation could be an appropriate translation and interpretation as well.
Is
But
that
yeah,
so? Yeah, so I'd been referred to Pesachim 116a, which I guess uh, and the disgrace or the degradation.
yes, I'm very glad that you were referred in that direction, because
Is that where you were going
that's
anyway?
exactly
All
where we're
right.
going to go next.
Oh, sorry. So I'll
No,
hold
no, no,
back then.
no, no. So it's great that you were referred there. Any before we continue, any other thoughts on why this is the essence of how we're supposed to tell the story, right? Like it could just say, I don't know, we were freed from slavery in Egypt. It could just be about
I
the praise of
I
glory. Yeah, Steve.
I'd suggest one more thing, just sort of the idea that we we were slaves in Egypt, and then were we slaves to God? And somehow the slavery in Egypt was a degradation, and the slavery to God is one filled with praising.
Yes. Beautiful. Any other thoughts or interpretations here? Steve.
I think it's actually a beautiful message that throughout our lives, the miracle of life is created by God, is that at any time, at times when we either are disgraced or we're traumatized or enslaved,
Mm-hmm.
we still have the strength and ability within ourselves through our behavior and our faith to redeem ourselves, to free ourselves, to move forward and with our faith.
Beautiful. Yep. And it's also sort of a reminder to us that these these situations will this was not sort of a one-time event, but these kinds of situations where we start in a place of degradation or disgrace, will continue to repeat over the course of our people's history and our people's future. So the rabbis ask, okay, so we learn that we start with degradation and conclude with praise. And certainly, if we go back to our core text here, Avadim Hayinu, that's what we see, right? We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. That's our disgrace or our degradation. And the Lord our God brought us out of there with a strong hand and an outstretched arm. And if the Holy One, blessed be God, had not brought our ancestors out of Egypt, then we and our children and our children's children will still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. So we started by talking about what our disgrace or what our degradation was. And then we moved to a place of praising God who took us out of the land of Egypt. But there's a very famous rabbinic debate about what actually should be the passage that begins this part of the Magid section that talks about moving from disgrace to praise. There are a few different ways of understanding it, and this is where we get to what Steve mentioned that he was being pointed to, this Psachim 116a. So this is a text from the Babylonian Talmud. And the rabbis actually disagree around what text should be in this part of the Haggadah that talks about the movement from our disgrace to praise. Okay, so I'm going to read this, and you can see it's really just like one line, but it's become a very important debate. Matchil biganut umisayem b'shevach. So we're quoting the Mishnah here. We're starting with our degradation and we're concluding with our praise. Mai biganut. So the sages are asking, well, what is the degradation that's being referred to here? Rav Omer, so our first sage, the sage named Rav, he said, Mitchila ovdei avodah zara hayu avotenu. He's referring to a different passage. He's saying, at first, our forefathers were idol worshippers. And Shmuel says, Avadim hayinu, right? That we were slaves in Egypt. And the text that we're already looking at. So Rav here disagrees. And Rav says, no, actually, the text that we should look at to refer to our disgrace is something else. And it's something that we can see comes later in our Haggadah, so that offers us a hint to, who won here. Although they're both texts are included. So let's look together at what is the text that Rav says should actually be in this place that describes the Jewish people's disgrace or degradation. And if you see where we were just at, we were slaves in Egypt. And if you look down a few more sections, you see in the beginning, our fathers were idol worshipers. So according to Rav, actually, this is the text that should have come right after the 4 questions that talks about our journey from disgrace to from degradation to praise. Mitchila ovdei avodah zara hayu avotenu. In the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. Ve'achshav kirvanu hamakom la'avodato. But now God has brought us close to God to serve God. Shene'emar, as it is said, and this is a quotation from the biblical book of Joshua. Joshua said to all the people, Ko amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael, thus said Adonai, the God of Israel, Be'ever hanahar yashvu avotenu me'olam, terach avi Avraham va'avi Nachor, ve'yavdu Elohim achirim. So Joshua said to all the people, this is what the Lord God of Israel has said. Beyond the river, your ancestors always dwelled. Terach, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. And then we keep reading, but I took your father Abraham from the river and I led him all the way across the land of Canaan, and I multiplied his offspring and gave him Isaac. And to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau, and I gave Esau Mount Seir as an inheritance, while Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. And then we read here, blessed is the one who has kept his promise to Israel, right? The promise being that I will take you out of slavery in the land of Egypt. So Rav thinks, actually, that this should be the text that comes right after the 4 questions, not Avadim Hayinu that we were just looking at. And by the way, just for a little bit of context here, this is talking about Terach, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor. Many of us are familiar with a very famous midrash, the idea that Abraham's father, Terach, owned this idol shop, and Abraham went in and Abraham smashed all the idols, and that was sort of like the beginning of the path toward building the Jewish people. And that midrash, in fact, is so famous that many people actually think it comes from the Torah. It doesn't. It's a midrash, but that's sort of the story that's being referred to here. So what's the difference between each of these 2 texts being what follows the 4 questions and what represents our journey from degradation to praise? What's sort of the core difference in the story that's being told there?
One is based on Genesis and the other is based on Exodus. That's one big difference, I think.
Yep, exactly. And if we're taking that further, Deb, go ahead.
The story, coming out of Egypt into the Promised Land has a more linear quality to it. Like, the world saw you as losers, and now the world sees you as winners. It's a really clear-cut pathway. And the story of Abraham is a much more winding, nuanced journey.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And so there's just like a very core difference here that according to the Avadim Hayinu text, the text that's in the Haggadah, our degradation was being slaves in Egypt, and then God freed us from slavery in Egypt. Whereas according to Rav, this text that moves us from our degradation to our freedom actually says that our degradation was not being slaves in Egypt, but that our degradation was in the fact that we used to be idol worshipers and not, worshipers of God. And so it's very interesting because it very much changes the character of what that degradation is and looks like. Alan, go ahead.
This smacks of original sin to me. And I've never looked at these passages the way you're doing it, and it's fascinating. Boy, I'd like to be a fly on the wall of the actual, well, there was, of the discussion that was going on about this. I wonder if Rav felt that the people of his time were ignorant of the Genesis story and needed to be reminded.
It's interesting. It's interesting. It also very much changes sort of like what the focus is in the praise and the thanks that we're offering on the night of the Passover Seder, because it wasn't exactly a reflection on us that we were slaves in Egypt, right? We just, we had some bad fortune, or not fortune, because it was all part of sort of the covenant that God had told Abraham. So we, kind of knew that this was coming, but it wasn't really about us, right? And when we talk about the idea that our ancestors were idol worshipers, that's actually kind of like a reflection on us. And the journey that we're therefore sort of commemorating there has something to do with a lack of knowledge and a lack of understanding on our part that God then helped to guide us toward in being able to move from idol worshipers to, worshipers of our God. Judy.
Does the idol worshiper story have anything that would substantiate the fact that we really were never slaves in Egypt historically? Would it still have something to do with escaping the Pharaoh, which
it's
really happen?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I actually think that this is sort of less a real historical reference and more a reference around wanting to make sure potentially that we're not being too narrow in our focus on the evening of Passover and saying we were slaves, we had a stroke of bad luck and we were slaves in Egypt and now we're free, but really saying we've had a very long history as Jewish people that goes from, really not having been coalesced in our worship values and in our God and as a people to eventually becoming slaves in Egypt to eventually, becoming free people. It's sort of inviting us to look at a longer arc of history as what it is that we're commemorating on the evening of Passover. Steve.
I liked your comment about not trying to not have a narrow reading of the Passover story. You could say that the approach of the Passover story is very similar throughout Torah, when God repeatedly says many times that if you don't follow my faith, be faithful in God and God's ways, you'll be cursed. Mm-hmm. And I think, particularly if you look at Deuteronomy and Nitzavim, where God is summarizing the teachings meant to be simple and internal, if you follow them, you will live. If you don't, you're going to be damned and cursed. So I think that when the Egyptian slavery story is like a metaphor that look at, and that wasn't just for the Jews, that you could say a commentary on humanity is created by God, that without people becoming a people of faith as defined by Torah, the world can be doomed in chaos and suffering. And really, it's a command and a call that The Seder and Passover are called to action to wake us up and separate us again from our and then go forward and take seriously following the faith in God's ways.
Yes. That interpretation very much resonates with me, Steve. I think it can be very easy when we're looking really just at the narrowest definition of the Passover story to see that, we had a stroke of bad luck and then God redeemed us and, now we're all good and we're going to celebrate that. But really, this is a call toward re-experiencing and recognizing again what are our responsibilities in the world. And in order to do that, we need to see ourselves as part of the actors and the people having responsibility in this story, and understand that the act of sort of building a community of faith is core to our ability to see the Passover Seder really as a call to action and not just as a, remembrance of, a stroke of bad luck a long time ago that, luckily we were able to then be freed from and escape. Steve.
So I was just also wondering whether, in a lot of Torah and in Mishnah, references to Egypt can be a reference to Rome at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, and this debate took place, I guess, I don't know whether it was after the destruction of the temple before, but somehow or other, it could easily have been that in some way the political hope of freedom was something that needed to be reinforced in some way.
Yes. That's interesting to sort of put it in that historical context in that way. And I think that's, very much a possibility here too. Alan.
The story is told again in another part of the Haggadah. My father was a wandering Aramean. And that begins without the Abraham's father being an idol worshiper.
Right.
So
right.
We've got the story told twice, once with a very different beginning.
Yes, it's true. Yeah. And it's interesting, that's not offered as one of the two answers to that question of we begin with disgrace and we conclude with praise. Just these two are, but that is also sort of another beginning to the Passover story. So yes, I think that's important that we point that out as well. So I'd love to look at a couple of contemporary interpretations of, sort of why this matters, and why this debate was between the rabbis of where we sort of start the telling of the Passover story and how we go from degradation to praise, of why that matters. The first is a little less contemporary. This is by Rabbi David Abu Darham, who we read a couple of weeks ago, who is a 14th century Spanish rabbi, best known for a really amazing commentary on the prayer book. And that could be another really interesting class someday to be able to kind of read through his commentary on the prayer book. But he sort of explains what we've already been talking about. So we'll read this just sort of by way of review. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. This is an answer to the question, Manish Tana, how is this night different? That is, since we were slaves to Pharaoh, we eat matzah and maror as they did. We are taught in Pesachim, which is the Mishnah that we read, one begins with disgrace and concludes with praise. In the Talmud, there is a disagreement. What is disgrace, Abaye says? At first, our ancestors worshipped idols. And Rava said, at first our ancestors were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Rava was of the opinion that since the whole matter of the Passover is the Exodus, there was no need to mention any other disgrace except for our enslavement. Abaye believed that we should mention the disgrace and praise of Egypt, mentioning the praise of the omnipresent, who raises the needy from the dung heap. We should also mention our ancestors' disgrace who worshipped idols, for there is no greater disgrace than idolatry. In disagreements between Abaye and Rava, the law follows Rava. So this is really just sort of like explaining our debate here. And the debate is it real? Are we saying like this is Passover and all that's relevant is the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt? That's it. Or are we saying, no, this disgrace goes back much further than that, and we need a larger context here. So he's sort of just helping us to encapsulate the essence of that debate. But I'd like to look now at Rabbi Jonathan Sacks and in his Haggadah and how he understands this debate and why, we're going to look today at two different contemporary perspectives on why this debate is important. So let's start by looking at the interpretation of Rabbi Sacks. The two opinions reflect different approaches to the Exodus. According to Shmuel, the central fact is physical redemption. Our ancestors were slaves who were liberated by God. According to Rav, the essential theme is spiritual redemption. Our ancestors were idolaters who found and were found by God. There is a difference, too, in their approach to history. Shmuel focuses on the immediate event of Egypt, slavery, and redemption. Rav places the event in a wider context, the whole history of the Jewish people from Abraham to Joshua and the conquest of the land. For Rav, Pesach is part of a larger drama, from founding father to the birth of a nation in its own land. Maimonides draws a third distinction. There are two elements to the Seder service. There is the story we tell our children and the story we tell ourselves. Shmuel focuses on the story as told to a child, right? And the story as told to a child is, this is what happened to our people many years ago. Rav speaks of the story as an adult reflection. Children can understand the drama of slavery and freedom together with the many miracles that were involved. It takes an adult to understand the journey from polytheism to monotheism, from myth to faith. So there are a number of different things that Rabbi Sacks is touching upon here. The first, which I think is very interesting, is that he talks about the difference between a focus on physical redemption and a focus on spiritual redemption. And I think that that's very interesting, right? That it can be very easy when we're looking just at the story of the Exodus from Egypt to focus on what that physical redemption was. But there was very much an element of spiritual redemption that is really essential to understanding this part of the story, and is also essential to understanding, if you're looking at the Torah and the story of the Jewish people after the Exodus from Egypt, you really need to be thinking about that idea of spiritual redemption to understand what comes next for the Jewish people, because we see, sort of built in together with wonderful moments for the Jewish people of, for example, receiving the Ten Commandments, moments of building a golden calf, moments of complaining that there's not enough meat to eat, that there's not enough water to drink, of all kinds of things that challenge that idea of spiritual redemption. And, what I think is really important to note is that in the same way that we see that path towards spiritual redemption is very rocky for the Israelite people from the time that they are freed from slavery in Egypt, really through the end of the Torah. This interpretation, the interpretation around spiritual redemption, it goes back a much, much, much longer time and helps us to understand this idea of spiritual redemption as a forever process for us as a people that we have to keep striving toward, right? That process of spiritual redemption and of coalescing as a Jewish people is one that never ends in our ancient texts and even today. And so it helps us to sort of take that broader view. Deb, go ahead. Deb, we can't hear you yet.
Yeah, I have to unmute. So Rabbi Blake has said on many occasions there's no actual architectural evidence for this story. And it seems that when you take it out of the simplistic, first we were there, then we were here, and remove any argument, well, did it really happen? We don't know, and just bring it to a more spiritual level. And I'm reminded a little bit of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where we're on a journey and we start out, we need the basics of life, but we're looking for self-actualization, and just bringing it into a context that is relevant for everybody.
Thank you, Deb. And I think that really gets at this description of the Maimonides' interpretation, right? That at the most basic level, we're trying to, gear this Seder experience toward our children and their understanding. And when you talk about sort of the hierarchy of needs, that they can understand what it means potentially to have been sort of physically enslaved in Egypt and then to be freed from that slavery. But then if we're talking about sort of our own process of questioning and understanding and reliving those experiences, there's more to that we need in order to see this as really, as Jonathan Sacks talks about, as a spiritual redemption, and not sort of just a story of physical redemption that we can get stuck in. And I think that that's sort of what Maimonides is getting at here, is that we need something that can help us to derive meaning from this story in as adults too. Any other thoughts on Rabbi Sacks's interpretation here? So I'd like to look at one more.
You missed Judy's hand. You missed Judy's hand.
I'm sorry, Judy. I didn't. Hold on. I still don't see you.
Do chat, so excuse me. I'm very backward at the computer. As I listen to this, all the times I've read it, I never thought there could be a connection. But when you take a look at idol worship, and then before you know it, the Jews actually are punished because they do enter Egypt and they are there. And then they become much more spiritual and they relate in greater ways to God. And so, quote unquote, God then forgives them, and the Jewish people are allowed to leave Egypt. Of course, when they leave, they're still doing some things that would be no-nos, obviously, like the golden calf, etc. But I think it shows that there's great forgiveness in God for mankind, because people aren't perfect. And that's how he created them, or she created them, or they created them.
Right. And that's a very interesting interpretation that actually gets at a later part of this text that we're going to look at together a little bit later on. This idea, and this is like a really interesting little section here that we're going to get at soon. And if God had not taken us out of the land of Egypt, we and our children and our children's children would still be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt, right? It's kind of like a weird passage. Why are we assuming that thousands of years later, if God hadn't taken us out of Egypt, that we would still be enslaved in Egypt? And what that's going to get at soon are some interpretations that that the Jewish people did not necessarily, through their own actions and behaviors, wouldn't have necessarily merited being freed from slavery in Egypt. But in fact, perhaps we're not necessarily to look at the fact that we were slaves in Egypt as a punishment, but as sort of part of the story of the covenant of the Jewish people with God, as expressed going all the way back to the story of Abraham and his conversations with God. And so, this section is to help us sort of reframe the idea that our redemption from Egypt had anything to do with our own actions, but was really sort of part of a larger story of our people and of a covenant with God. I I believe I saw George had a hand up and then Steve.
Yes, I had a thought when someone said there's a question of whether or not this occurred at all. And I'm reminded of something that was said that some people take the Torah Bible literally, other metaphorically. But the question is, what can we learn from it?
Mm-hmm.
And it was said here this morning that if we start in a bad place, we have the strength to survive. In 1933 through 1945, most of the Jewish people found themselves in a bad place. Half of us didn't survive. And it was really a question of, will we survive?
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the creation of Israel. And we were totally freed and became independent. And so what we're taught is that in every generation we have bad times. And whether or not the Passover, the Exodus actually took place the way we've read, really doesn't matter because we're here today. And if we find ourselves in a bad place in the future, we do have the strength to survive.
That's beautiful. Yes. And we have the stories as a people, whether they actually happened or not, to turn back to help us to find that strength during those difficult times. Steve.
I think it's also a beautiful part of the learning from Rabbi Sachs when he talks about there being two elements, the story we tell our children as opposed to the story we tell ourselves. And I think that's wonderful to help us pause and reflect on that, because a lot of the Haggadah is geared towards what we're commanded to tell our children, which is an incredible mitzvah and blessing. But it's also recognizing what we've all just been discussing and learning from each other. What are we learning in terms of how we move forward the messages, and to address both of those during the Seder?
Yes, I agree. It can become very easy to get kind of caught up in what we're commanded to tell our children, and at a certain point to just decide, that this is for them and not us. And so it's important, I think, to have this another way to look at the story that can continue to speak to us in different ways. I'd like to look at one other contemporary interpretation of this debate about what it is that is actually supposed to start our people's story going from disgrace to praise. And that actually comes from a podcast that was released just a few days ago. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can optimize the audio for that podcast. But this is from the podcast called Call Me Back with Dan Senor, who is the author of the book Startup Nation, and who has put together a podcast that's been sort of especially meaningful in these months since October 7th. And he did a pre-Passover episode with Rachel Goldberg Polin, the mother of Hirsch, of blessed memory, who was in captivity for over 300 days and was very sadly murdered by Hamas in captivity. And in this podcast, Rachel actually talks about the very rabbinic disagreement and debate that we're talking about right now. And she provides a little bit of her own interpretation. So I thought it might be meaningful for us to listen to that together as well. Oh, hold on. Sorry, I keep forgetting to optimize the sharing here. Let me try this one more time. There we go. We're going to listen to a section that's about 2 minutes long.
So the Haggadah contains a line that, well, let me say a couple of things. One,
it contains a lot of lines.
It contains a lot of lines. One, there's a word that we constantly say throughout the Seder, which is zachor.
Yes.
Memory. Zachor, we see that word, I think, in during Pesach, during the Seder, probably more than we at any other time in the Hebrew calendar, and in any holiday. So why memory, Zachor? Like, why is this everywhere in the Seder?
We have a funny relationship with remembering, we Jews. I'd even say all people, because remembering can be very grounding or it can be very drowning. And we have to be very careful with what we do with how we remember things, because it is self-defining. Who are you? Don't forget where you come from. Don't forget what you're made of. Don't forget what you believe in. Don't forget what your values are. And on the other hand, if you're only looking back to define yourself, because time unfortunately flows forward and our trajectory is forward, if we're not looking forward and allowing ourselves to also be who we're going to be, not just be who we've been, then we end up hitting the present or the future with the back of our head, and we're not ready. So I think that there's that tension in the Haggadah of, remember where you came from. You were slaves. You were no one. You were the lowest of the low. And actually, there's a debate in the Haggadah of, where do you begin telling the story? In the section called Magid, which is the storytelling part, where do you start the story? And there's a debate between two rabbis. Who'd have thunk it? There'd be a debate between two rabbis. One says you start it with the story of the slavery in Egypt, and the other says, no, you have to start it way, way, way back before then, before when Abraham's father owned an idol store. He owned idols are us. We were idolaters. And there's the question of, why would we start it there? And it's the stereotypical Hollywood answer of, you want to start the backstory. You got to start it way back, right? Like at The Godfather, it starts way back. And because then the excitement of where we end up is so much more dramatic. So, we start the story talking about that we actually used to be idolaters. Like, we didn't even understand that there was one God running the show. And we have to remember that we come from a place where we didn't always understand that there was godliness, that there was a rhyme to this reason. And then the story takes off from there. And there are so many different parts. Also, there's one of everybody's favorite songs is Dayenu. Now people
Explain.
Also like, well,
I'll stop there. The next part is interesting too, but I would, by the way, recommend to all of you the whole podcast if you have time to listen to it before Passover. It's really moving, and I think for me very much in keeping with our commandment to make this story relevant for us year after year, to listen to Rachel Goldberg Polin basically, offer her interpretation of the Passover Haggadah in the context of where we are today and where she is today and what she's thinking about. So anyway, it's the podcast again. It's Dan Senor. It's called Call Me Back. And this is, I believe, there have been one episode recorded since then, but one of the two most recent episodes with Rachel Goldberg Polin. So what did you hear in this section around sort of her interpretation or understanding of why we might be having this debate of where we start the Passover story and where she lands on it, Steve?
I thought that was beautiful. It relates to your earlier comment about don't narrowly approach and experience Passover. Really, you could say the Passover story is just another narrative but you start with Genesis. Genesis provides the fundamental foundation of learning about the human condition and the various narratives, starting with Adam and then with Noah, and then you have our patriarchs and moving on. That really explains the human condition as being taught to us by God, and the important role of faith, that life without faith, see what happened, but with faith, it makes a huge difference to allow humanity to move forward in a more orderly way and try to reduce the trauma of chaos.
That's beautiful. And it really gets at what Rachel said, toward the end of the segment that we watched, where she talked about leaving out the earlier section of our story really makes it easy to forget about what that path toward godliness looks like. And the way she defines godliness is understanding a rhyme or a reason to the course of history, which obviously we can't always do. And I think it would be disingenuous to say that we can always interpret and there's always a good reason why things happen, but that perhaps that sort of is our task as Jews, to look at our history not sort of in isolation as things that happened to us, but even if we don't understand why they happened, to then try to understand what they're here to teach us and how they should help to influence our future. And so it's our job to sort of make a rhyme or a reason out of our experiences as a people. Again, not to say these bad things happen to us for this reason, because that we can't do, and I think presents all kinds of theological problems. But to say, well, now that this happened, how are we going to try to understand it so that it can help to guide our actions here moving forward? Any other thoughts on that segment that we just listened to? The other piece that really sticks out for me is the very beginning of the segment, where she talked about how the way in which we remember things is self-defining for us and can be, she says, either grounding or drowning. And I think that it's a really important reminder that, again, of sort of how much intention we need to and want to have in telling these stories of our people's roots, because remembering can either guide us toward the future or can force us to become sort of stuck in the past. And I think that, the way in which we do our remembering is what helps us to allow our past to guide our future. Any other thoughts on this section? Scrolling through and looking. So anyway, I thought, Alan, go ahead, please.
The conversation just right now is talking about the past and the future, and it makes me remember a teaching from Rabbi Avi Weiss of Riverdale, who said the Haggadah is like a timeline. The first part of the Haggadah and the Seder is history. The describing the Seder plate and describing the questions, why, and then that's the past. And the current is the meal. And then the future is the hope of Hallel is hope and praise for the future. So those three time segments are in the Seder.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes, exactly. The Seder really does. It does very intentionally take us sort of from past to present to future. And it's not always the easiest to sort through all of it, because sometimes those things are intermixed with each other. But that's sort of our way of remembering as well. Any other thoughts on this? So with that, then, again, like I said, we were going to kind of spend most of our time on that little section because that rabbinic debate has actually become very significant over the years in understanding the Passover Haggadah. But I'd still love for us to spend just at least our last 15 or 20 minutes looking at some other pieces of the Avadim Hayinu section. So the next section that I'd like us to look at together is the one that we just talked about, we referred to a second ago. This idea if God had not taken us or had not taken our ancestors out of the land of Egypt, we and our children and our children's children would still be slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. That's kind of a strange line for a number of reasons. It's a strange line because why would we be making that assumption that we would still be slaves thousands of years later to Pharaoh in Egypt? And like, why is that helpful to put in here? But it's also a little bit confusing because according to sort of our understanding of our biblical texts, it's just not true. And so I'd like to look at discussion of that question right here by the Ritba, his commentary on the Passover Haggadah. This is Rabbi Yom Tov ben Avraham Ishbili, who's a Spanish rabbi who was alive in the second half of the 13th century and the first part of the 14th century, who's actually one that I don't know a lot about, but who has a very good commentary on the Passover Haggadah. And he says, there are those who ask how it is possible to say this sentence that we would still be slaves in Egypt if God hadn't have redeemed our ancestors so many years ago, given that God had already promised to Abraham in the episode of Bein HaBetarim that God would take them out of Egypt in the end, and there were no conditions to this promise. So I want to look at this episode with all of you. There's an episode in the Torah that's referred to in rabbinic literature as Bein HaBetarim, which means like the splitting of the birds. And so I'm going to read this with you, but basically we can see that God already promised that God was going to take our ancestors out of the land of Egypt. So this passage saying that if God hadn't have done that, we would still be slaves in Egypt makes no sense because we see dating back all the way to the Torah that God already promised to take the ancestors out of the land of Egypt. So it doesn't seem helpful to make that statement. So we're going to read chapter 15 of the book of Genesis. Sometime later, the word of Adonai came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Avram, I am a shield to you. Your reward will be very great. But Avram said, O Lord Adonai, what can you give me, seeing that I shall die childless? And the one in charge of my household is Dameshek Eliezer. Avram said further, since you have granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir. The word of Adonai came to him in reply, saying, that one shall not be your heir. None but your very own issue shall be your heir. Then in the vision, God took Abraham outside and said, look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Continuing, so shall your offspring be. And he put his trust in Adonai, who reckoned it to his merit. And then God said to him, I am Adonai, who brought you out from Ur of the Chaldeans to assign this land to you as a possession. And he said, O Lord Adonai, how shall I know that I am to possess it? And God said to Abraham, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old she-goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young bird. So Avram, who was his name at the time, brought all of these and cut them in two, placing each half opposite the other, but he did not cut up the bird. Birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Avram drove them away. And then we read, as the sun was about to set, a deep sleep fell upon Avram, and a great dark dread descended upon him. And God said to Avram, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end they shall go forth free with great wealth. So what we're seeing here, this episode is very famously called, and I think it's important to read it because it's referenced often in rabbinic literature, Bein HaBetarim. And the word batar means to cut in half. And it's this sort of strange episode between God and Abraham, where God asks Abraham to cut in half these animals as a symbol of this covenant between God and Abraham. And in that, as part of that covenant, God promises to take the Jewish people, the Israelite people, out of the land of Egypt after their slavery. So it seems strange that then we would have this line talking about how we might possibly be still slaves in Egypt, because it almost like seems like it serves to question that covenant with God. And so here's Ritba's answer to that. It seems we should explain this by saying that if God hadn't taken us out of Egypt as God had promised to our ancestors, that generation wouldn't have been worthy of redemption because they had learned the ways of the Egyptians and had become mixed up with them. So, does anyone have any thoughts or interpretations here? I have some thoughts about, sort of what Ritba is meaning to say in sort of offering this reframing, which is not that we would still be slaves in Egypt because God wouldn't have followed through on that covenant, but that we would still be slaves in Egypt because the ways of the Israelite people had become sort of mixed up in the ways of the Egyptian people, and we wouldn't have necessarily merited redemption from Egypt. Any thoughts on that, on this?
Cantor?
Yes.
It smacks of a retrojection into the Genesis text to explain the redemption from Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. And there's a little piece that I just realized I was missing, that I actually didn't translate the whole text. I want to continue with everybody a little bit more, the last few lines in the Hebrew. ולפיכך אנחנו חייבים לחשוב עצמנו כאילו נגאלנו מאותו עבדות אנו ובנינו. And therefore, we are meant to think of ourselves as though we ourselves had been redeemed from the land of Egypt. And then at the end, we say, "Lefichach tziono haborej lesaper b'chol dor vador neseh." And in every generation, we're supposed to sort of experience this miracle for ourselves. And, I think also sort of getting at what we were discussing before, this is sort of a reminder to us, again, to avoid the trap as having seen our history as having been a reflection of like a stroke of bad luck that that God fixed for us, and now we're all good, but seeing this as sort of a call to action, and then therefore being able to look back and not saying that our slavery in Egypt was punishment from God. I actually don't think that that's what this is meant to say, but it's meant to help us see ourselves as real actors and real participants with responsibilities in our future story. Any other thoughts on this piece? So, yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Well, I think it gets back to, as you just said, trying to understand what in Genesis, what is the meaning of when God's made certain promises to Abraham. I think it could be read to mean that going forward, your people will at times face trauma and challenges. I will always be with you and be there to help guide you. The promise is not to become a people of faith. The promise is I will then intervene maybe at times during these challenges. But then the actual freedom in Exodus is not just a freedom from slavery, but an obligation to enter into the covenant and a challenge to become a people of faith. And God is not guaranteeing, quite the opposite, that we will succeed in becoming a people of faith. That's going to be the constant challenge and mitzvot to all of us. We've got to work repeatedly towards this. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a better way maybe to understand the communication between God and Abraham.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's beautifully said. Any other thoughts on this piece before we're going to look now then just at one last line in our last few minutes together of this text. V'chol hamarbel l'saper b'tziat Mitzrayim hareze mishubach. and all of those who expand on the telling of the Exodus from Egypt, so like going beyond your core requirements and discussing it even more, that's very praiseworthy. What's really interesting here is that there are older versions of the Haggadah that actually take out the word marbeh and just say v'chol misaper b'tziat mitzrayim harei ze mishubach, all who tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, that's praiseworthy. That was sort of an original version of the Haggadah. And it changed to all who expand upon the telling of the story of the Exodus from Egypt are praiseworthy. And Abu Draham says to us, this is what we read: anyone who tells of the Exodus from Egypt at length, the more praiseworthy it is. We do not say the one who tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt is praiseworthy. Since it's a mitzvah to tell the story of Passover in the first place, we wouldn't say it is praiseworthy since it's obligatory. However, since our text says the more one tells of the Exodus, it is more fitting to say it is praiseworthy. It means it is obligatory for us to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, but even if one only spoke a word in general regarding the Exodus, one has fulfilled this obligation. But if one speaks about it at length, it is praiseworthy. So it's just interesting to sort of read about how that text has been changed to recognize the fact that it's really just like our mitzvah. It's our obligation to tell the story of Passover, and so we added that word, those who expand upon the story. That's something that's praiseworthy because we want to really kind of like go in depth in the telling of this story. So I'd like to conclude then with two contemporary reads of the end of this section of the Haggadah. The first from Rabbi David Silber, who is the Rosh Yeshiva at Drisha, which is a kind of a modern Orthodox yeshiva in New York City. And he points to the fact that if we turn back to our Avadim Hayinu prayer again, we see va'afilu, and even if we were all people who were wise, we were all people of understanding, we were all people of age, and we all were people who were very knowledgeable in the Torah. And he picks up on the word on the fact that the word kulanu, all of us, is repeated 4 times. Again, very representative of the importance of the number 4 in the Passover Seder. But he says the word kulanu, we all, repeats itself 4 times in this brief passage and echoes the last of the 4 questions, which asserts that on the Seder night, kulanu misubin, we all recline. In its repeated use of this word, the Haggadah seems to be underscoring the importance of inclusiveness at the Seder, but it also highlights another theme central to Passover. The repetition of the word kulanu conveys a sense of multitude and abundance, and indeed the Seder is a ritual of exaggeration and excess. The Haggadah declares that everyone, kol, who lengthens the Exodus narration is worthy of praise. And in the narrative passage that follows, we tell of the 5 scholars in Bnei Brak who stayed awake telling of the Exodus throughout the entire kol Seder night. Rather than resolving a Talmudic dispute concerning which passage should begin the Exodus narrative, we include both options. We dip vegetables not once, but twice, etc., etc. And so this idea that we're repeating the words related to kol to all of us over and over and over and over again is a way of helping to emphasize the fact that being as expansive as possible in the observance of this ritual is what our goal is here, which sort of gets at what we were talking about before, that it's praiseworthy to expand upon the telling of the story of the Exodus. And we'll conclude then just with one more interpretation by Rabbi Sachs. And he's sort of getting at this question of, at the end of this text, we're saying, even if we all knew the whole Torah and the whole Haggadah and we're all knowledgeable and we all have been doing this a long time, we still have to tell the story. And so what he's asking is, what's the difference between knowing the story and telling the story, which is what this last sentence of the Avadim Hayinu is getting at. There is a fundamental difference between knowing and telling the story. We do not tell the narrative of the Exodus to know what happened in the past. We do so because each telling engraves that event more thoroughly in the memory, and because each year adds its own insights and interpretations. Judaism is a constant dialogue between past and present, and since the present always changes, there is always a new juxtaposition, a new facet of the story. The sages said there is no house of study without chiddush, without some new interpretation. The story of Pesach never grows old because the struggle for freedom never ends, and therefore each generation adds its own commentary to the old new story. So I think this very much sort of encapsulates what we've been doing together over these past 3 weeks and is a reminder that the reason that we tell the story, even though we know it, is because the retelling every year is what allows us to get to those new interpretations that help us to, as Rachel Goldberg-Polin said, helps our history to ground us and to express our hopes and goals and responsibilities for the future rather than to drown us, right? If we just know the story, then our history can drown us because we're just kind of getting stuck in a telling of the story and an understanding of the story that we're used to. But once we tell the story every year, that's what allows the story to grow and to change in the way that it resonates for us this year and in years in the future. And so with that, I hope that this is a year of many interpretations and reinterpretations and new understandings of the Passover story. And I hope that if there's something that in your Passover Seder that your loved ones discuss together that brings you new understanding of a piece of the Passover story and a piece of the story of the redemption of the Jewish people, that you might share it with me, because I would love to hear what you come up with at your Passover Seders. And with that, I'll wish everybody a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a kosher and joyous holiday. And I'll look forward next year to starting to make our way through the next sections of the Magid story. So happy Passover to everybody.